And since our project involves a component of world making, we thought we'd make a world and take you to that world to present the project. And so Marcus has created a world which we will take you in right now. And in this world, there's an object, which is a fictional object. It is Plato's cave. And that's a very famous sort of philosophical allegory, or more like a parable, actually, although the two are closely related, that you've probably heard of, maybe a long time ago. And you're probably not aware of some of the aspects of that parable. So what we want to do is we want to walk you through the landscape of Plato's cave while introducing you to the parable. And then we want to connect that to the activity of the zone and the reason for the zone to exist. And for some really interesting reasons, this parable of the cave is at the bottom of a lot of the crises. I overheard at the end of the last discussion that there's a crisis in art, there's a crisis in science, there's a crisis in society, there are crises everywhere. And in a funny way, Plato's cave is at the bottom, quite literally, of all those crises. So let's dive in and quickly explore first. Marcus is taking us into the entrance now, down this sort of shaft into Plato's cave. So in its historical context, the cave was an attempt to get rid of old mythological narratives. It's a parable about how we perceive reality. And Plato sees us as inhabitants of the cave. So we're all chained with our arms to the rock. And we're looking at the wall of the cave that's opposite of us. We're all prisoners in this cave. Behind us, there's a source of light which provides some diffuse and flickering light. And through that light, you can see shadows on the wall. These shadows are caused by objects that are behind us. And this is Plato's way of saying all our perceptions of the world, our experiences, are but shadows. We cannot really see what's real. What we see are reflections, derivatives of what's really going on. And Plato's vision of a philosopher, this is published in the Republic, where he wants to make us believe that the state should best be run by philosophers. Probably not a good idea. But his image of a philosopher is a prisoner that breaks from those chains and manages to walk back up into the light. Now, this journey is very important. If you just turn around and you stare into the sun, you will see nothing. You will simply be blinded by the light. So you need to go slowly, and that's actually described in the original story. The journey up into the sun, the world that is real, is called anagogy, or ascent in ancient Greece. It is a transformative journey. You cannot just unchain yourself and walk up. You need to transform yourself on the way. One aspect of that is you need to complexify. The world is complex, and you need to have a more complex view of the world to understand it. The other aspect is decentering. When you're a child, you're very self-centered. And as you grow mature, you shift that focus more and more from egocentric to omnicentric. So these two things have to happen on this journey. This is an aspect of the parable of the cave that's rarely told, but we think it's the most important aspect of the story. Because if you arrive out at the top, where Marcus has taken us, and if your eyes have adjusted, you finally see the world as it is. And for Plato, that is a world of ideal form, pure abstraction, famously, he thinks that an idea in Plato's sense is like an essence. Think of the chair you're sitting on. There's many different chairs, but there's some sort of organizational principle that makes a chair a chair. It's important to say that for Plato, this is not some sort of transcendental world. It's part of the same world that we see in the cave. And there's a journey from A to B. Of course, Christianity later takes this idea, developed through Neoplatonism, Augustine, and then Aquinas, and makes this ideal world into the world of God that you cannot understand rationally. You must be called to it through faith. So this parable becomes the foundation of 2,500 years of trying to understand the world in both a religious and a secular way. And because there are two worlds, this real world of abstract forms and the actual real world of the phenomena, it's called a two-world mythology. So the philosopher returns from this world into the cave and tells the other prisoners about her experiences. Of course, they cannot understand her. And funnily enough, and this may sound familiar, a lot of the chained prisoners do not even want to talk to her or leave the cave. Ironically, what Plato has done by writing this parable against the mythology of his time, against narratives of gods and mythical creatures and demons, is he has created a new mythology. Because what he's done here is a myth. It's a very powerful myth. And as such, I think it's still very important, as we will see, especially this story about the anagogy, the ascent into the real world. While this idea that the real world isn't really real and the abstract world is more real than the real world is, of course, completely mistaken. It is an example of what philosopher Alfred North Whitehead has called the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. It's mistaking the abstract for the real. So what we have to do to understand the current meaning crisis is we have to put the parable of the cave on its feet, turn it inside out. This is the main problem. We have to understand that the world that is hidden from us, behind the illusions of our everyday life, we have to understand that that world is inside us. It's inside our physical world. It's not transcendent. The only thing that transcends is us. This parable is about self-transcendence. We have to change to understand the world. And if you think about that, that's very different from how we think about understanding the world in scientific terms today. We just use a method, like an algorithm. We apply it to the world and we understand it. But what Plato is telling us is that it's a journey that involves changing ourselves to understand the world. So the hidden reality beyond the phenomena is the world that every one of us brings forth, our subjective world, and how that arises from our being in that real physical world out there. So in a way, what we are doing through the complex flow of mutually self-generating, self-organizing processes that we call ourselves, is we make a world. Every one of us makes a world within the world. And if we want to understand reality, if we want to understand what's going on, if we want to make meaning, make sense, we need to understand those worlds. The problem, of course, is that science can't do that. Every world within you is your own. It cannot be generalized at all. So science cannot deal with it. What's worse is that you don't see the process by which you make meaning. Before you can reason about something, you need to decide what to care about. You need to decide what is relevant. And that is not a rational process. In order to reason about something, you need to know what to reason about. So there's a problem, a very deep problem. And it used to be that art would be busy with these subjective aspects of the world, while science was doing the objective part. But it seems like the two are disconnected, and both of their efforts are disconnected somehow from the world itself. The crisis that we're having is that the two worlds of Plato are no longer viable. We cannot believe in an ideal world of forms. And yet we have no understanding of that inner engine within us that makes sense of the world. So what we try to do in the zone is we're trying to do arts and science, but not just by combining art and science, not just by introducing scientific practices into art or the other way around, but what we want to do is we want to be a collaboratory for world and also myth making. We want to be a sanctuary for developing an ecology of practices to produce a narrative with meaning. The zone is an empirical experiment in the cultivation of meaning and wisdom. It is an oscillation in the space between art, philosophy, and science. It's not a combination of those. The zone is serious play. We want to infinitely change the rules. We want to push the boundaries. And the zone is like this process that makes meaning. It is not a machine. It is a vortex of world making. So what we want to do is we want to open the floor right now in case you have clarificatory questions. We want you to hold on to other questions you may have, because what we want to do is we want to take you into one of those shadows in the cave. Each one of them provides the basis for a different discussion. So after this short break with questions, we would like to take you into the shadow that is about world making and talk a little bit more about that. But first of all, how lost are you? And is there any way we can help you back? Do you have questions about the zone in terms of what this is about? Clarification of our presentation. Bashak, is anyone out there raising their hand?
No, but I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Not about the zone, but I want to understand the relationship of seriousness with playfulness.
One aspect of what I just said is that you cannot understand what's going on just by thinking about it. And the reason is that if you think about the way in which you make sense, it's like you're like being a fish in water. You cannot do this. Because the way by which you make sense of the world, you can't make sense of that yourself. You make sense through it. Without it, you cannot make any sense at all. So it's invisible to us, just like in the parable. There is a world that is invisible to us. We cannot see it because it is the kind of thing that brings forth our own world. And so all you can do is you can experience it. You need science to understand it, but it's not enough. So you need to play with serious scientific and philosophical ideas. You need to explore it so that you can make it explicit, that you can become aware of the whole thing. And this requires, that's why we call it an ecology of practices. This is a term by John Vervaeke. He has a wonderful YouTube series online. It's here in the heap of literature. It's called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And I highly recommend it. It's 50 lectures long. It's very long, but it's well worth your time. And it deals with all these sort of aspects of meaning making that go beyond science. So we're not saying that you shouldn't use rationality. We are saying that in order to use rationality properly, you need to understand how you come to think about certain things rationally. You need to understand how you realize the relevance of something. And you can only do this through playing with it. The only way to understand that process is to play with the process itself, because you cannot just step out of it, because all meaning making is lost if you do. So you cannot scientifically investigate it because you are in it, but you cannot only use art either, because you need all the science you've got to understand it. And in this way, you have to sort of play with ideas that come from art, philosophy, and science. And this is what we're trying to do. I don't know if that helped.
Johannes, I have a question here before you dive into deeper in this cave. I like the idea of the micro and macro combining here in your word modeling. And when you say you need to complexify to simplify in your word modeling, I want to know how much references do you take from the real world to create your own word? And how much abstraction do you, how does it work?
This is great. So there's a big difference between knowledge and understanding, which is also deeply connected to what we're talking about here. You can have as much knowledge as you want about the universe, propositional knowledge, facts that you can logically combine and build theories. But that is not enough, because there are different kinds of knowledges. To quote Vervaeke again, you have perspectival knowledge, which is sort of situational awareness. You have procedural knowledge, that's skills, you know, how to do something, et cetera, et cetera. So all these kind of knowledges, they combine together, and just knowing about the world doesn't mean that you're making sense. And this is where understanding comes in, because if you think about it, we are extremely limited as human beings in our capabilities to understand. We cannot understand too complicated connections and systems. So we must always find a compromise between the complexity of the real world and the relative simplicity of our own being. And what we're talking about here, this anagogy, is about complexifying the processes by which you make meaning. But there's only so far you can go. So you have to simplify the world. And the way you do this is very mysterious, because there are an indefinite number, maybe infinite number of things that could be interesting in the world. So how do you decide what to pick out? That's the problem of relevance. Vervaeke calls this relevance realization, and this is a process we do not understand very well. How do you pick out of a potentially infinite amount of interesting things what you personally care about, or what our society or humanity as a whole cares about? This is a process that cannot be rational. It cannot be based on a systematic algorithmic approach, because there's just too many possibilities. But it's also not completely chaotic. This process has evolved. It's constantly evolving, in fact, even during your lifetime. It's adapting to your environment. To quote the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, it's trying to get a grip on your reality. You are an agent in an arena, and you're trying to understand this specific arena, the environment you are in. And the arena is not just your physical environment with all its facts in it, but it's those physical aspects that are important to you. Psychologists call this a salience landscape. How do you decide what is salient, what is important, what is in your focus? This has a lot to do with how we think about consciousness. A lot of what the function of consciousness is probably related to picking out relevant facts. But how this process works exactly is utterly mysterious. Computers cannot do it. And I've just argued in a paper that we can't make computers do it. So how do we do it? So what we try to do here is develop practices to play with this process and to find out how can we train it to get a better grip, because the meaning crisis we have in arts and in science right now has a lot to do with a missing grip, with choosing the wrong sort of things to be relevant, with a disconnectedness of, you know, what's really relevant in your life. And that is getting worse and worse. And we're saying you cannot do it by purely subjective artistic exploration. You cannot do it by purely objective science. We need to find new ways to combine those in a practical way to play and make sense of how we make sense, if that makes any sense.
I would like to, I'm so sorry, else you, I think, asked before me. Please go on.
Well, I do have a few questions, but thank you, first of all. I think this is really, really amazing and inspiring. And I totally, and thanks, Essa, by the way. I totally relate to this meaning crisis that you talk about, that this is something that requires attention and creative approaches. I'm just wondering if, first of all, if you're gonna, or if the idea was to invite us to actually play with this tool that you made, or if we already have, because I have a lot of like reflective and philosophical questions, but I'm also super excited to actually try out the tool. I don't know if that was your intention for us to do now, or did I misunderstand?
Marcus, is that possible? Can people play with it?
Well, you can direct me to play with it.
Okay.
It's a bit difficult to give it to you to play. But I guess the option would be to start adding elements that we feel are necessary. As you can see, we've started to add references and elements to the cave itself. We're going to move into one of the shadows, and we could very much create worlds within other shadows quite easily as we discuss it and you guide me through it. But unfortunately, these two tools that I have here, only I can control right now. And you could treat me as a puppet master and tell me what to do. Yeah. So we can happily manipulate the space, break it apart, build it back together again, whichever you'd like.
It would be great if we could do, I mean, this is world making in action. We're going to talk about this in a second. It would be amazing if we could create a world in which you could also start discussions. As a first step, what we wanted to do, we're just starting to play around with the technology, is to develop this virtual cave as a platform from which we jump off into different discussions. So we were thinking about how can we have a Zoom zone, a forum where we discuss what we're doing with other people. And we said, we don't want another moderated discussion. What can we do to make this a bit more inspiring, experiential? It's not just about inspiring people, it's about experiencing the ideas in a different way than just reading or hearing about them. And so we hope to use this as a platform for jumping off into all kinds of discussions in the next few months. We'll broadcast those on our website. So that's the general idea, but maybe to illustrate what we can do, Marcus, what do you think? Maybe we should just enter the world-making shadow.
Let's enter the first shadow.
So we've picked this shadow as a prototype discussion to just show you, illustrate a little bit what's going on. So we've entered this room with a mysterious glow. And as we said, we need to put the parable of the cave upside down. We don't really need to exit the cave, leave it behind. It's all in the journey. And instead of going outside, we can go deeper into the cave. So Plato in the original story never goes into the shadows to explore the shadows themselves. And I said before that the worlds that are invisible to us, they're not out there, they're not abstract, they're within us. So maybe going through our shadows is a good metaphor, visual metaphor, for turning the cave inside out. And so this first cave that we entered here is about world making, and interestingly also about myth making, which are connected. And we use the term myth here in a very specific way. We'll come to that, but I want to first introduce what we mean by world making. It has very different meanings for scientists, philosophers, and artists. So if you're a philosopher, you will recognize the term world making as a term that philosopher Nelson Goodman used to talk about how we make sense of the world from different frames. It's a version of the frame problem that you know maybe from discussions about artificial intelligence. What is your standpoint? How do you choose the frame in which you look at the world? And so Goodman said, quite literally, that if you, for example, believe in the Copernican system, the heliocentric system of the world, you are literally living in a different world than somebody who believes in the old Ptolemaic geocentric system. So you see the world from a different frame. And that means there are really two different worlds, because if you make statements in one world or the other, different statements will be true. This is very interesting. And it was very revolutionary 50 years ago. It's a little outdated nowadays. We have better ways of dealing with personal perspectives in epistemology and philosophy. So this is not the way in which we see world making here. If you're a scientist, you may have a different view of world making, especially if you're a cognitive psychologist. And this goes back to the theories of Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana, who said, they're the fathers of embodied cognition. They said every being, just by living, brings forth a world. So you are world making just by living. What do they mean by that? First of all, you are what they called an autopoietic system, a system that generates itself. You maintain yourself alive. And because you're alive, you have certain goals, intentions, motivations. And so you encounter this physical world. And I said before, it's just sort of an indefinite number of interesting things. Which ones are you going to pick out depend very much on your own motivations, on your goals. So you are looking out, to use the term of Gregory Bateson, you are looking out for differences in the world that make a difference. Information is difference, but the only information that counts is the difference that makes a difference to you. And you can see that in this way, you sort of generate part of your environment. The world isn't just there, it's not passive. The world of meaning doesn't come from within, it doesn't come from outside, it comes out of the interaction between you and your environment. So it's not subjective, it's not objective, but as John Vervaeke calls it, it's transjective. Meaning is a transjective property. It is a property of your interaction with the world that comes out of this process of interacting. So when we say you are making a world in a scientific sense, then this is what you're doing. To bring forth your own world, subjective world, interior world, yes, but in interaction with a world that's much bigger than you, that often doesn't care about you. It's not all internal discourse. The world is real and has real consequences, as we are learning every day. Then there's a third way of looking at world making, of course, and that's the artistic world making. Speculative fiction, fantasy worlds, J.R.R. Tolkien or Ursula Le Guin, two of my favorite world makers. Magical realists like Borges, Italo Calvino. So these three ideas of making a world, speculative world that we've created here with Plato's cave, the world that you bring forth, and even the philosophical perspectives that came out of Nelson Goodman's work, they are all, of course, related. So we are constantly making worlds. And the way we make worlds, again, to repeat, is not a machine, it's not an algorithm, it's an evolutionary process. It's constantly adapting to your environment. You either have a good grip on it, on the environment, or not. But how you do this is not a matter of pure science or pure subjective art. It is a matter of how the two interact. It's transjective. And without realizing this, nothing makes sense, literally. There is no sense making. So exploring that process, again, involves practice, and the particular practice is serious play, play with ideas from art, philosophy, and science. And it's not seeking a balance or a final result. It goes on and on and on, and it doesn't settle, it oscillates. So the question whether we are doing art or science or philosophy becomes completely irrelevant. We are doing what is required to move between worlds. The last thing I wanted to talk about is myth. So look at this world. We've just created a new world. I don't know if you've noticed, Marcus made a world on the left that's very different from the Plato's cave world. While we were talking, he created this geometrical structure, which is very rich. We can look at the other world through it. It gives us a new perspective. So by creating worlds, what we want to do, by getting a grip on our reality, what we want to do is we want to deal with problems. Making sense means that you can deal with problems that you have that are important to you. And so we bring in the idea of a myth. A myth could just be a fairy tale, an ancient narrative of monsters and gods that is no longer relevant to you, maybe, in today's context. We're not talking about myths like that. We are talking about myths that are stories, like Plato's cave, that help us make sense of really, really deep and perennial problems. The problem of absurdity. How can we make meaning? If we don't make meaning, the world is absurd, it's alienating, it's terrible. And so John Vervaeke has done quite some work on the ultimate modern myth, which is the zombie apocalypse. Okay, why are zombies so popular? Nobody believes in zombies really, outside of some parts of Haiti probably. Why are we going on zombie walks? Why are we watching zombie movies? Why is everything zombie so popular? So the zombie, the modern zombie, is a myth. It's a parable for the meaning crisis. We are the zombie. We no longer make sense of the world. We have lost our grip. But it's not a very good myth. If you think about Plato's cave as a myth, it doesn't just realize the problem. Realize both in making sense of it, making you aware of it, and actualizing it. But it provides a solution. Anagogy is the solution. You get to wisdom, you cultivate your wisdom, and you make sense. The zombie myth does none of that. It just states our present condition and leaves us with it. So it's not a good myth. It states the human condition clearly, but it doesn't help you get past it. It doesn't help you solve the problem. So what we do when we make new worlds that make sense is we create myths like Plato's cave that is no longer valid because we no longer believe in two worlds. But we have to create myths that are appropriate for our time. Through storytelling, through practice, through science, through art. And this is what the zone is trying to do. Plato's cave has been useful for 2,500 years, but it no longer is now. But it has not been replaced by anything. So to end this part of the presentation and open up the questions, I would like to give you a few quotes from a wonderful book by William Irvin Thompson called The Time Falling Bodies Take to Light. We will take a little bit of time to read those because they illustrate very beautifully what I just said before. The first thing Thompson says is that myth is the history of the soul. Again, there's no mysticism here. By the soul, he means exactly this process of relevance realization that we were talking about before. That is your soul in this sense. And by just doing art subjectively, by just doing science objectively, we don't get at that process at all. And so Thompson writes, the history of the soul is obliterated. The universe is shut out. And on the walls of Plato's cave, the experts in the casting of shadows, the scientists, tell the story of man's rise from ignorance to science through the power of technology. That's the Enlightenment, modernity. That's not enough. The revisioning of history is also an act of prophecy. Not prophecy in the sense of making predictions, for the universe is too free and open-ended for the manipulations of a religious zealot. But prophecy in the sense of seeing history in the light of myth. Myth like we talked about before. And one last quote. In the classical era, the person who saw history in the light of myth was the prophet. In the modern era, the person who saw history in the light of myth was the artist, a Blake or a Yeats. But now in our postmodern era, the artists have become the interior decorators of Plato's cave. We cannot look to them for revolutionary deliverance. As a final point in his book, he introduces the concept of what he calls Wissenskunst. So it's like Wissenschaft, science, but it's an art of knowledge and wisdom. It is not concerned with what you could call the nomological order, the laws of the world, how we relate to the laws of the world. That's science. It is not concerned with the normative order, how do we behave towards others. It is concerned with narrative, telling a story about ourselves. And both Thompson and Vervaeke argue that this is what we've lost, and we cannot do without this narrative. So what we need to do is we need to play seriously with narratives, unique narratives of time, grand narratives that are forbidden in postmodern theory. We need to play with those, being aware that we're ironic. We're not taking ourselves too serious because we do not have the ultimate history, but we have to play with those narratives because we cannot live without them. So Wissenskunst is what we're after. And this is what we will be exploring in the zone.